I made certain he attended the finest schools, had every door open for him, and never once felt the financial strain his mother and I had wrestled with in our early years. But sitting in the corner of the lavish dining room at the Ridgemont Country Club for his wedding rehearsal dinner, I came to a stark realization I had not raised a man. I had bankrolled a monster. The room was saturated with opulence. Crystal chandeliers poured a warm golden glow over tables adorned with imported calla lilies. Welcome back to his hidden revenge. I'm glad you found your way here today. If this is your first time, tap that subscribe button so the next story comes straight to you. It costs nothing and means a great deal. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, what are you up to while you listen? Driving somewhere, cooking dinner, maybe just resting at the end of a long day. I always like to picture who's on the other end of this. Now, a brief note before we continue: some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth carried inside it. I sat quietly near the back of the room, wearing the same navy blue suit I had worn to Eleanor's funeral. Clean and pressed, but unmistakably from another era. Across the hall, Ethan sat beside his bride Natalie. She was 30 years old with a sharp, calculated beauty and a smile that never quite touched her eyes. She held court among her bridesmaids, her voice carrying effortlessly over a string quartet, playing softly in the background. I cannot believe he actually pulled that battered 12-year-old pickup into the valet line. Natalie laughed, lifting her champagne flute. It is like a janitor wandering into a black tie gala. I told Ethan his father needs to stay out of frame tomorrow. I will not have that shabby look contaminating my wedding photos. The bridesmaids tittered. I sat there, hands flat on the white tablecloth, feeling something cold tighten in my chest. I looked at Ethan, my own son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy I had sat beside through the long, feverish nights. He was right there next to her, wine glass in hand. He heard every syllable, and he said nothing. He's offered a weak, squirming little chuckle and glanced away. That silence cut deeper than anything Natalie could have said out loud. What Natalie did not know, and what Ethan had taken great care to hide from her, was the truth of how this extravagant weekend had been paid for at all. 2 months earlier, Ethan had shown up at my door, nearly in tears, telling me his investments had collapsed and he could not cover the wedding. To spare him the embarrassment, I quietly wired $8,000 to handle the venue, the catering, the flowers, and the open bar. Ethan told Natalie and her entitled parents that he had funded it all himself from a large cryptocurrency windfall. I let him have that story because I loved him. I believed I was guarding his dignity. Instead, I had bought myself a front row seat to my own humiliation. After dinner wound down, Ethan caught my eye and motioned for me to follow him into the mahogany-paneled hallway outside the banquet room. For one brief, foolish moment, my heart rose. I told myself he was going to apologize, that he was pulling me aside to thank me privately for the $8,000 and admit he was sorry for Natalie's cruelty. "Dad, listen," Ethan said, pacing on the thick carpet, visibly restless. "We've got a situation. Natalie went over the honeymoon itinerary, and the standard overwater bungalow in the Maldives just isn't going to work. Her friends are booked at the premium resort on the other side of the island. I need you to wire me another $15,000 by tomorrow morning to lock in the upgrade." I stared at him, searching his frantic, hungry eyes for some trace of the boy I raised. "You are asking me for another $15,000, I said, my voice low and level. "After I just wired $8,000 for a wedding, you are telling everyone you paid for yourself." Ethan ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Come on, Dad. You live in a small house and drive a truck that belongs in a junkyard. You don't even touch your money. What are you sitting on it for? This is my wedding. It is the most important week of my life." "I am not giving you another dime, Ethan," I said steadily. "You need to learn to live within what you have." His expression hardened. The panic drained away, and what replaced it was a cold, ugly entitlement. "You know, Natalie warned me about this," he muttered, his voice going sharp. "She said your cognitive decline was making you paranoid and tight-fisted. Fine, keep your money, old man, but don't expect us to come around playing happy family when you're sitting alone rotting in that house." He turned and walked back into the party, leaving me standing by myself in the hallway. The words cognitive decline rang in my ears. He was already building the narrative, framing my refusal to be his personal bank as a symptom of deterioration. I needed air. I could not walk back into that dining room and face those people. I turned and pushed through the heavy doors leading to the venue's kitchen. The moment they swung shut behind me, the polished elegance of the evening gave way to the raw, beautiful chaos of a working kitchen, hissing pans, shouting line cooks, the crash of silverware. The second I stepped inside, everything briefly stilled. The executive chef, a broad-shouldered man named Leon, wiped his hands on his apron and came straight over. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his tone carrying unmistakable respect. "What an honor, sir. Is everything to your satisfaction? Can I set up a private table in the back for you?" I smiled at him warmly. "The food is outstanding as always, Leon. I just needed somewhere quiet to collect myself. Carry on, everyone." The kitchen staff gave respectful nods and returned to their work. This was the second thing Ethan did not know. When Eleanor and I were starting out, we opened a small diner. Over 40 years of grinding work, careful investment, and disciplined living, that diner grew into something far larger. Today, my private holding company controls an entire portfolio of hospitality and real estate across the state. I do not merely patronize the Ridgemont Country Club. My holding company owns the entire catering and hospitality group that staffs it. Every chef, every manager in this building works for me. I wear a worn chambray work shirt and drive an old truck because I have never let go of where I started. True wealth is quiet. It is only the newly minted who feel the need to announce it. While I stood in the corner of the kitchen, nursing a glass of water, the swinging doors flew open. Natalie swept in, face flushed and furious, a crystal wine glass gripped in her hand. She made straight for a young waitress who looked barely out of high school terror written plainly across her face. "Are you completely incompetent?" Natalie's voice bounced off the stainless steel walls. "I asked for a dry Pinot Grigio, and you brought me a Chardonnay. Do you have any idea what my husband is paying you people to be here? You are absolutely useless." The girl's eyes filled with tears as she stumbled through an apology. Natalie simply drove the glass into the girl's chest, soaking her uniform in wine, and turned on her heel and left. Leon looked over at me, his face pale. He knew I had seen every moment of it. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply rested a hand on Leon's shoulder and walked out the back into the cool night air. The final piece had settled into place. This was not simply an ungrateful son. I was looking at two toxic parasites who had decided that access to my money entitled them to treat working people like objects. The next morning, the wedding day, the air hummed with nervous energy and the scent of costly floral arrangements. I arrived at the venue early and settled quietly in the grand lobby outside the bridal suite. The doors eventually opened, and Natalie emerged complaining loudly into her phone about the makeup artist. When she spotted me seated there, her face pulled into a mask of undisguised irritation. She ended the call and crossed the lobby toward me, silk robe trailing the floor. "Gerald, let's get something clear before this ceremony begins," she said, arms folding tight across her chest. "I have already spoken with the photographer and the wedding planner. You will be seated in the 4th row during the ceremony, not the front." I looked up at her, calm. "The father of the groom is traditionally in the front row, Natalie. Not when he refuses to dress the part," she said flatly. "Ethan told me you won't help with the honeymoon. If you're going to be a stubborn, tight-fisted old man, you can sit in the back with the distant relatives. I will not have your look spoiling the front row of my photographs. Are we clear?" I looked at this woman, the woman about to become my son's wife, and felt something unexpected settle over me. The hurt had gone quiet. In its place was a cool, deliberate clarity. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and drew out a thick, crisp white envelope. I held it toward her. Natalie's eyes landed on it immediately, and the greed that flared in them was completely unguarded. She assumed it held the $15,000 Ethan had pressed me for the night before. She pulled it from my hand with a triumphant little smile spreading across her face. "I'm glad you finally came to your senses, Gerald," she said, tapping the envelope against her palm. "Sit in the 4th row, keep quiet, and try not to embarrass us." I rose slowly from the chair. "Enjoy your wedding, Natalie." I turned and made my way back toward the banquet hall. She had no idea yet, but what she had taken was not simply an envelope of cash. Inside it was a voided check and a handwritten note, the first domino in her complete and total undoing. The trap was already laid. All that remained was to wait for the reception. The grand ballroom of the Ridgemont Country Club was a monument to excess. Crystal glasses clinked beneath the surging sound of a 12-piece live orchestra playing songs I had never heard in my life. Towering arrangements of white peonies sat on every table, climbing so high that guests had to peer around them just to hold a conversation. I had been placed at table 16 precisely where Natalie had instructed. It was wedged into the far back corner, right beside the kitchen's swinging doors. Every time a server pushed through a wave of hot air, and the smell of roasting meat rolled over me. The other guests at table 16 were distant relatives of Natalie's parents who spent the entire evening griping about the humidity and paying me no attention whatsoever. That was perfectly fine by me. I sat in my faded suit, nursing a glass of iced water and taking in the room. I watched Ethan laughing loudly with his groomsmen, swirling a glass of scotch that likely cost more than my first car. He looked polished in his tailored tuxedo, but there was a restless wired energy underneath it all. He was performing wealth, playing the role of a self-made man for a room full of people who only cared about his net worth. I knew the truth. I knew his accounts were hollow. I knew he was buried in debt. And I knew my quiet sacrifice was the only thing standing between him and total collapse. But I held my silence. I simply watched the waiters moving through the crowd with practiced ease. Each time one passed my table, they offered a small, respectful nod. They knew exactly whose company signed their checks. The music softened, drifting into a slow, romantic ballad. Couples drifted toward the dance floor. I was cutting into my steak when I saw her. Natalie was making her way through the crowded tables, her enormous white gown sweeping against the chairs as she moved. She was clutching the white envelope I had given her that morning, in her right hand, her knuckles pale from the grip. She was smiling at guests as she passed, nodding like the radiant, composed bride she was playing. But the moment her eyes found mine near table 16, that performance dissolved. What replaced it was pure venom. She moved with intention, brushing past the distant relatives at my table, who had gone suddenly silent, and leaned over my shoulder, bringing her lips close to my ear so the music would swallow her words. The thick sweetness of her perfume was almost suffocating. "What kind of sick joke is this?" she hissed to her voice, a tight, cutting whisper. She dropped the envelope onto the table beside my water glass. The flap had been torn open. Visible at the top was the voided check, and beneath it the handwritten note that read simply, "Respect is earned, not bought." She pressed closer, her manicured nails curling into the white tablecloth. "You think you are so clever, Gerald?" she spat. "You think this makes a point. Ethan told me you were holding out on the honeymoon money because your mind was slipping. But this is not dementia. This is just pathetic. You are a cheap, bitter old man who cannot stand to see his son happy." I looked down at the voided check, then back up at her face. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I lifted the cloth napkin from my lap and calmly wiped my mouth. "Natalie, there is a very expensive party going on around you," I said evenly. "A party you did not pay for. I suggest you go and enjoy it." My composure seemed to enrage her further. The color rose in her face beneath the layers of makeup. "Do not speak to me like I am one of your uneducated friends," she sneered. "You have been an embarrassment since the moment you set foot in this country club. Look at yourself. You look like someone who wandered in off the street. You are ruining my wedding with that cheap suit and your miserable disposition. Ethan is ashamed of you, and honestly, I cannot blame him. He told me he dreads bringing you around my parents because you have absolutely no class." Those words were designed to wound. She wanted to watch a father's face fall apart at the revelation that his own son was ashamed of him. But that pain had already been spent the night before. What remained now was something colder, the quiet certainty of consequence. "I am sure Ethan has said many things, Natalie," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even. "But class is not defined by the suit you wear or the car in your driveway. Class is how you treat people when you believe you hold all the power. And you have shown me exactly who you are." She let out a sharp, scornful laugh. "Who I am the woman who is taking your son far away from your sad little life. We do not need your honeymoon money. Ethan has plenty from his investments. We do not need you at all, Gerald. The only reason you are even sitting at this table is because I pitied you. I wanted to give you the opportunity to prove you could belong in our world, but you proved precisely the opposite. You are just a stingy old fool who thinks a piece of paper gives him some kind of power." I let my gaze drift across the room. Ethan was watching from the bar. He could see his new wife hunched over my table, visibly furious. He could see me sitting there, absorbing it. And just as he had the night before, he turned away and pretended not to notice. He took a long sip of his scotch and laughed at something someone said. He was making his decision in real time. I brought my attention back to the bride. Her breathing had turned heavy, her eyes burning with something that felt almost suffocating in its intensity. "You are right about one thing, Natalie," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, measured tone. "This voided check does not make me powerful. It was a test to see whether you valued family over a luxury vacation, a test to see if my son would stand up for his father. You both failed." She straightened up and smoothed the bodice of her gown, her expression twisted into something raw and undisguised. "I am done with this, Gerald," she whispered, each word soaked in contempt. "You have embarrassed Ethan for the last time." I glanced past her toward the bar. Ethan was still there, his back fully turned to us, deep in conversation with a groomsman. He was making a deliberate choice, letting his new wife dress down his father in front of a room full of people. He had traded his own blood for the illusion of belonging. The boy I had raised, the boy I had given everything to, he was gone. The man at that bar was someone I no longer recognized. A deep, quiet grief moved through me. Not for the son I was losing that day, but for the son I had already lost long ago without ever seeing it happen. Natalie caught me looking at Ethan and gave a soft, cruel laugh. "Don't bother looking at him, Gerald. He is not coming to your rescue. He does not care about you. Do you want to know what he said to me last night after you refused to cover the honeymoon upgrade? He said he cannot wait until you finally pass away so they can sell that little house of yours and put the money towards something that actually matters. He is waiting on his inheritance. You are nothing to him but a countdown." The brutality of those words hung between us. She delivered them, wearing a triumphant smile, convinced she had just dealt the blow that would finally break me. She wanted to watch me collapse. She wanted tears. But the truth is, her words were freeing. Whatever guilt had still been clinging to me dissolved entirely in that moment. They had dug this pit themselves with their bottomless greed and their complete absence of decency. I owed them nothing. No loyalty, no protection, and certainly not another dollar of what I had spent a lifetime building. "You are remarkably confident, Natalie," I said, my voice low and unhurried. "You stand here in this beautiful ballroom drinking imported champagne, eating prime steak, and you believe you have conquered something. You look at these chandeliers and these white-gloved waiters, and you believe all of this luxury is yours by right. You think you have risen above people like me." She drew herself up, tall, eyes bright with arrogant pride. "I do not just think it, Gerald. I know it. Look around you. This is my world now. This is the standard of living I deserve. Ethan and I belong in places like the Ridgemont Country Club. We belong among the elite, and you belong in that battered pickup parked out back. You are a relic, Gerald. You are a reminder of a past Ethan is working so desperately to put behind him." I took a slow sip of my iced water, savoring the profound irony of her little speech. She was boasting about her standing among the elite while holding court in a building owned entirely by the man she was dressing down. Every waiter serving her, every chef preparing her food, every manager ensuring her evening ran without a hitch ultimately answered to me. The very floor beneath her feet belonged to my holding company. She was a guest in my house, mocking me for not belonging. "I am done wasting my breath on you," she continued, her tone sharpening. "I have a wedding to enjoy. I have hundreds of important guests who need my attention, people who actually matter, people who will not drag down my social standing simply by association." She stepped back and leveled a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "Let me make this very simple for you, Gerald. You are going to leave. You are going to get up, walk out those doors, climb into your miserable little truck, and drive back to whatever lonely life you came from. You will not eat the food here, you will not drink the wine, and you will certainly not appear in any of our family photographs." I set my water glass down on the table. The ice shifted softly against the crystal. The distant relatives at my table had given up any pretense of not listening. They were staring outright, mouths slightly open. "Are you telling me to leave my son's wedding, Natalie?" I asked, my voice perfectly level, entirely free of anger. "I am not telling you, I am ordering you." She snapped, her voice rising just enough to turn a few more heads nearby. "You are a toxic, embarrassing presence, and I will not allow you to ruin my evening any further. You are cut off, Gerald, from us, from our future children, from everything." She flung a dramatic gesture toward the heavy oak doors at the front of the banquet hall. "Get out of here and do not come back. You are not welcome." The music seemed to dim as those words settled over the table. Get out. You are not welcome. The ultimate rejection delivered with maximum cruelty. She stood there, chest rising and falling, with the effort of her fury waiting to see what I would do. She expected me to argue. She expected pleading, perhaps, even a scene, something she could use to have security remove me while she played the wounded victim for her well-heeled guests. Instead, I did the precise opposite. I laid my cloth napkin neatly beside my untouched plate. I drew a slow breath, letting the cool air of the ballroom fill my lungs. I placed both hands on the armrests of my chair and rose deliberately to my full height. I stood taller than Natalie, and as I straightened up, she instinctively moved half a step back, though she held her aggressive stance as best she could. I looked down at her, not with a glare, not with a frown. I simply regarded her with a quiet, knowing smile, the kind that belongs to a man holding every card in the deck while watching his opponent fan out a losing hand. I reached down and fastened the center button of my faded suit jacket, then smoothed the lapels and brushed away an imaginary speck of lint. I felt entirely, completely free. The grinding weight of trying to purchase my son's affection had lifted from my shoulders. The compulsion to shield him from the wreckage of his own arrogance was gone. You are right, Natalie, I said, my voice carrying a warm, almost measured calm. I truly do not belong here at this table. The smug satisfaction that crossed her face was immediate. She folded her arms, fully convinced she had claimed the victory, that she had driven off the embarrassing father-in-law and cemented her position in polite society. I am glad you finally understand, she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. Now leave. I gave her one last pleasant nod. All right, I replied quietly, but I will take some others with me. I turned my back on her bewildered expression and began to walk, not toward the front doors where she had pointed, but directly toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. The real reception was about to begin, and I was the one holding the baton. I took a slow, deliberate breath as I moved. The deep thrum of the orchestra vibrated up through the hardwood floor beneath my worn leather shoes. Guests were laughing, clinking champagne flutes, entirely unaware of the quiet revolution about to take shape. Behind me, Natalie radiated the satisfaction of someone who believed she had just routed a tired old man from her flawless society event. She must have thought I was retreating to the parking lot to sit alone in my battered pickup and nurse my wounds. I could almost feel her triumphant smirk pressing into the back of my neck. But I did not move toward the main lobby. I walked straight to the polished mahogany doors of the catering kitchen. The shift from the ballroom's grandeur to the raw operational heart of the country club was always striking to me. I pushed through the swinging doors into the sharp fluorescent light beyond. The heat of the commercial ovens hit me along with the deep, rich scent of roasting garlic. Dozens of chefs, line cooks, and servers were moving in a tightly choreographed rhythm of culinary precision, plating the secondary courses, staging the dessert tiers. Standing near the central prep station was Patrick, the venue's general manager. Patrick had worked within my holding company for nearly 15 years. He was exacting, thorough, and knew my corporate operations down to the last detail. He spotted me the moment I came through the door and set down his towel, stepping away from the prep line. He approached with a look of quiet concern, reading something in the way I was carrying myself. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice low and respectful. "Is everything all right in the dining room? Do you need a private space?" I shook my head slowly and met his eyes directly. "Patrick," I said, my voice calm, but carrying a weight that drew him to full attention. "The groom and his bride have just informed me that I am no longer welcome at this establishment. They have told me to leave the premises immediately." Patrick blinked. His professional composure cracked for just a moment. He glanced toward the swinging doors, then back to me, visibly at a loss. "Sir," he said carefully, "this is your building. Your company owns the entire hospitality group. Every person in this room works for you. They cannot ask you to leave." I offered a small, quiet smile. "They are not aware of that fact, Patrick, and I intend to honor the bride's demand to the absolute letter. I am leaving right now, but as the sole owner of this operation, I am calling for an immediate and total cessation of all services for this event." Patrick did not waver. He did not ask for clarification or raise any concern about the financial fallout. He simply straightened his tie and gave a single composed nod of complete loyalty. "Understood, Mr. Callahan. What are your exact instructions?" "Baon de vapor seno ixaor." I looked around the busy kitchen at the line cooks and servers who depended on this work to care for their own families. Every staff member is to receive their full wages for the entire weekend, I told him. No one loses a single dime because of my family's choices, but I want this venue shut down immediately. Stop the music, stop the food service, pull the bars, we are walking out. Patrick nodded once more. He reached into his pocket and brought out his two-way radio, pressing the transmission button. All staff, he said, his voice measured and clear. This is Patrick Code Black on the wedding reception. Cease all operations immediately. Set down your trays. Step back from your stations. We are evacuating the floor. I pushed back through the kitchen doors and stepped into the ballroom one final time. I positioned myself near the edge of the dance floor and waited. The orchestra was midway through a lively, buoyant number. Guests were spinning and laughing beneath the crystal chandeliers. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. It was not a loud sound, but Patrick, who had followed me out, caught the signal immediately. He turned and gave a sharp nod to the orchestra leader. The music stopped. Not a graceful fade, an abrupt total silence. The drummer cut off mid-stroke. The brass section lowered their instruments. The lead singer pulled the microphone from his lips and killed the amplifier. The silence that collapsed over the ballroom was stunning in its totality. Hundreds of guests stopped mid-step on the dance floor, glancing around in bewildered confusion. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd, some assuming it was a planned interlude or a surprise toast. But the quiet only deepened, pressing down on the room like a weight. Then the real departure began. On the far side of the hall, a waiter carrying a wide stainless platter, heaped with premium rack of lamb, simply came to a stop. He set the platter down on the nearest guest table, directly on top of an elaborate floral centerpiece, and walked away. Across the room, another server carrying a dozen crystal champagne flutes placed his tray on a cocktail table and turned his back. One by one, the serving staff abandoned their positions. The layered clatter of trays and china being set down on tables rippled through the hushed room. At the main bar, the scene was even more striking. Ethan had been standing there, waiting on a refill of his expensive scotch. The bartender, a seasoned employee named Calvin, glanced at his radio, then at Ethan. Without a word, Calvin took the bottle of premium whiskey from the counter, twisted the cap back on, and lowered it into a heavy transport box beneath the bar. He then began locking the liquor cabinet, snapping the brass padlocks shut with loud, definitive clicks. "Hey, what are you doing?" Ethan demanded, his voice landing awkwardly in the silence. "I asked for a drink. Open that back up." Calvin did not even glance at him. He simply wiped the marble counter, folded his towel with precision, and stepped out from behind the bar to join the growing assembly of staff gathering at the back of the room. Ethan stood there, his face darkening with a mixture of humiliation and rising fury. He looked around the room and finally registered what was happening, a mass-coordinated walkout by the people he believed he was paying to serve him. Natalie was still standing near table 16, right where I had left her. The smug authority had drained completely from her face, replaced by open bewilderment. She watched as the waitresses she had berated earlier quietly unknotted their aprons and draped them over the backs of empty chairs. She watched the band members fitting their instruments into black cases with calm efficiency. She watched the guests murmuring urgently to one another, demanding to know why their half-finished meals were being abandoned. "What is happening?" Natalie's voice came out high and frantic. She seized the arm of a passing waiter. "Where do you think you are going? Bring out the next course right now." The waiter gently but firmly freed his arm. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone perfectly polite. "This event has been officially terminated by the owner. We are vacating the premises." "Owner!" Natalie's voice shot upward as she spun around wildly. "Ethan is the owner of this event. He paid for all of this. Ethan, get over here and sort this out right now." Ethan rushed over, looking utterly helpless, his phone already out, frantically trying to reach the wedding planner, who was already heading for the exit clipboard tucked under her arm. I stood near the main entrance, adjusting the cuffs of my jacket with deliberate calm. Patrick walked up beside me, followed closely by the executive chef. Behind them, a quiet, orderly line of 45 staff members had formed. They stood with composed dignity, people who had been treated like furniture by this couple and were now choosing something different. I looked at them and gave a slow, grateful nod. They had stood with me, and I would stand with them. I turned and started toward the grand double doors of the main lobby. I did not look back. I walked with the unhurried, steady pace of a man who no longer had anything to prove. Behind me, 45 sets of footsteps rang out on the marble floor in a quiet, unified procession. "Gerald!" Natalie's voice tore across the ballroom. The commanding arrogance was entirely gone. What replaced it was raw, undisguised panic. She had finally seen it. The man she had banished. The man she had mocked for his outdated clothes. He was the one leading the entire staff toward the door. "Gerald, what did you do?" "Tell them to come back. Ethan, do something, make them come back." Ethan broke into a jog toward me, his face pale and sheened with sweat. "Dad," he called out, his voice breaking. "Dad, please wait. What is going on? Why are they following you?" I did not slow my stride. I pressed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby and stepped out into the cool night air. The valet staff were already returning keys to puzzled guests who had begun drifting out of the ballroom. I walked down the curved stone path to the far end of the parking lot, where my battered 12-year-old pickup sat parked in the shadows. I unlocked it, pulled open the heavy door, and settled into the driver's seat, the worn fabric familiar against my back. Inside the ballroom, Patrick was the last one standing. He positioned himself near the main electrical panel at the back of the hall, and looked out at Ethan and Natalie standing stranded in the middle of the dance floor, ringed by abandoned food, bewildered guests, and complete humiliation. Patrick gave a single quiet shake of his head, reached out and gripped the heavy metal lever of the master breaker. Natalie let out one final scream of pure panic just as he pulled it down. The massive crystal chandeliers extinguished in an instant. The accent lights, the bar lights, the stage lights, all of it gone in a fraction of a second. The entire grand ballroom of the Ridgemont Country Club was swallowed by absolute darkness. A wave of gasps and alarmed voices filled the night, followed by the heavy thud of the front doors locking from outside. I turned the key in the ignition, listened to the engine stir to life, and pulled slowly out of the country club, leaving my ungrateful son and his cruel bride sitting in the darkened wreckage of their own arrogance. The engine settled into its steady, reliable hum. I sat in the far corner of the parking lot, tucked under the shadow of the old oak trees lining the property. The night air was cool, threading in through the cracked window with a faint trace of pine. I rested my hands on the worn steering wheel, feeling the rough texture built up by years of honest work. I did not drive away just yet. I stayed because I wanted to see the full cost of what arrogance looks like when the bill comes due. Through the windshield, I watched the grand entrance of the country club. Those massive double doors, usually flanked by welcoming valets and warm light, were now flung open, pouring a disorganized stream of bewildered, irritated guests into the night. Men in expensive tuxedos held up their phones, using the dim glow of flashlight apps to pick their way along the darkened stone paths. Women in silk gowns stood shivering in the cool air, clutching wraps and voicing their displeasure loudly. With no valet staff to retrieve their cars, a long, frustrated line had formed at the parking booth. People were shouting over one another, jostling to find their vehicles. Full trays of appetizers sat abandoned on the lawn, waiting to be discovered by birds in the morning. Security was nowhere in sight. I watched a man Natalie had spent the evening trying to impress throw his hands up in frustration and disappear into the dark. The polished high society occasion she had spent months constructing had collapsed into a chaotic, embarrassing evacuation. No one was speaking about the beauty of the bride. They were talking about their empty plates and the indignity of fumbling around in the dark. Inside the quiet cab of my truck, the silence broke without warning. My phone on the passenger seat lit up sharply. The screen blazed in the darkness, showing Ethan's name. It vibrated against the cracked vinyl with an urgency that perfectly mirrored the panic I knew he was feeling. I did not answer it. I watched it ring until it rolled to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it lit up again. Then again. A relentless series of incoming calls, Ethan pressing desperately over and over. He had just watched the entire fiction of his self-made millionaire identity dissolve in front of the exact people he had been performing it for. The carefully constructed facade had been stripped away, leaving nothing underneath but a frightened, heavily indebted man standing alone in a dark room. The screen showed a dozen missed calls in the span of 3 minutes. Then the text messages began arriving in rapid bursts, each one flashing briefly on the lock screen. "Dad, where are you? Turn the lights back on this instant. You are embarrassing us. Please answer the phone." I read each message with a slow, steady calm. It was striking how fast his tone had swung from high-handed dismissal to frantic pleading. The man who had stood by silently while his wife hurled cruel insults at me was now demanding I pull him back from the wreckage of his own spinelessness. I settled back against the headrest and exhaled a long, slow breath. I felt nothing resembling pity. Pity belongs to those who stumble through honest mistakes, not to those who calculate your value by what they can drain from your accounts. The phone went quiet for a moment, and a small icon appeared signaling a new voicemail. I reached over, picked up the phone, and hit the speaker button. I wanted his voice in the open air. I wanted to measure precisely how desperate he had become. The message opened with a heavy, ragged inhale. The background was pure chaos, overlapping voices of furious guests threatening refunds and promising to flood every review platform they could find. "Dad, what the hell did you just do?" Ethan's voice filled the small cabin of my pickup. He was nearly hyperventilating, his words spilling out in a breathless, panicked rush. The entire staff just walked. They cut the power. The catering manager left us standing here with nothing to serve. Half the guests have already pulled out of the lot. Natalie is locked in the bridal suite, falling completely apart because her parents' friends are demanding answers. "You need to get back here and fix this right now. Tell whoever you paid off to restore the power." There was a brief pause on the recording as someone shouted at Ethan in the background. When he came back on, the panicked edge had drained away, replaced by a hollow stab at intimidation. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," he snarled into the phone. "You think this is some kind of lesson, but you just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. I know you paid for the venue, but you do not get to shut it down because your feelings got hurt. We had a verbal agreement. I am holding you personally responsible for this disaster. I am going to sue you for breach of contract. I am going to drag you into court and make you pay for every single penny of the damages the venue is going to charge us for this walkout. You are going to pay for ruining my wedding." The voicemail clicked off, leaving a hollow beep hanging in the air. I sat there in the dark and released a deep, genuine laugh, a rich, booming sound that had not lived in my chest for years. Ethan wanted to sue me for breach of contract. He wanted to hold me legally responsible for the walkout. His entitlement had blinded him so completely that he could not grasp the full scope of what he was threatening. He assumed the Ridgemont Country Club was some vast, untouchable corporation that would surely go after whoever had torpedoed their event. He had no idea that I was the corporation. He was planning to sue the very man who held the contract he was waving around. He was threatening to drag me into court over a venue penalty that I alone had the authority to issue. He thought he was boxing me in, using the threat of financial ruin to force my hand. What my foolish son did not know was that my legal team had already been instructed to draft the damage invoice. I was not going to be the one writing the check. I was going to be the one cashing it. I reached over and turned on the radio, letting the soft hum of a classic country station wash over the distant shouting still drifting from the club entrance. I put the pickup in drive, the old transmission clunking faithfully into gear. As I rolled out of the lot, leaving the darkened venue behind, I caught one last look in the rearview mirror. The procession of departing headlights looked like a funeral march for my son's counterfeit life. The real fight was only getting started, and Ethan had already placed the weapon I needed directly in my hands. I drove into the dark, ready for whatever the morning would bring. The morning sun threw a pale wash of light across the worn formica countertops of my kitchen. I sat at the small wooden table, both hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of bitter black coffee. The house was utterly silent, a comfortable, settled silence I had grown used to since Eleanor passed. Our home was modest, built on decades of honest work and careful living. The walls were a plain off-white, the appliances older, but well kept. I never saw the point in replacing things that still did their job. Ethan had always despised this house. He called it a depressing monument to mediocrity. To me, it was a fortress of integrity. I took a slow sip, letting the dark liquid warm my throat. I felt remarkably rested after the spectacle at the country club the night before. I had driven home, stood under a hot shower, and slept 8 solid hours. A clean conscience is the finest sleep aid a man can possess. My quiet morning was shattered by a rapid, furious pounding at the front door. The heavy wooden frame shook under each blow. The doorbell fired in short, frantic bursts, the chime bouncing through the hallway. I did not hurry. I set my mug carefully on the table. I rose, smoothing the front of my worn chambray work shirt. I walked the short corridor at the unhurried pace of a man who already knows what is waiting on the other side. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Ethan and Natalie stood on my small concrete porch looking utterly wrecked. Every trace of the polished, pristine image they had projected the night before was gone. Ethan still wore the same wrinkled dress shirt from the wedding collar, open fabric darkened with sweat. His eyes were bloodshot and darting. Natalie looked worse. Her elaborate bridal updo had collapsed into a tangled wreck of blonde extensions and stray pins. Her heavy makeup had migrated south, leaving dark smeared circles beneath her eyes. She stood shivering in the morning chill, an oversized jacket thrown over a pair of sweatpants. They looked like two survivors of a shipwreck who had washed ashore and were hunting for someone to blame. "What were you thinking?" Ethan screamed the instant the door opened. No good morning, no acknowledgement that I existed beyond being the source of his suffering. He lunged forward, his face deepening to crimson, his voice cracking under the combined weight of exhaustion and raw rage. "You completely destroyed my life, Gerald. You ruined the most important night of my entire existence. Do you have any idea what you have done?" I stood motionless in the doorway, blocking the entrance. I looked at my son and felt a brief flicker of sorrow for the wreck standing before me, before the memory of his actions closed that door completely. "I know exactly what I did, Ethan," I said, my voice low and stripped of all feeling. "I left a party where I was not welcome." Natalie shoved past Ethan, a trembling manicured finger, jabbing the air inches from my face. "You are a spiteful, vindictive old monster," she rasped, her voice rough from a night of screaming. "You think you made some kind of point by throwing a tantrum and walking out. You made us the laughingstock of this entire city." My parents had to personally apologize to the mayor because he was left standing in a dark banquet hall. "My friends are treating me like a charity case. You humiliated us in front of every person who matters." "You humiliated yourselves, Natalie," I said quietly. "I simply turned off the lights so everyone could see you clearly." Ethan's hand came down hard against the wooden doorframe. "Cut the philosophical garbage, Dad," he snapped. "This is not about hurt feelings anymore. This is about cold, hard cash. After your little stunt shut the venue down, the general manager locked us out and handed us a preliminary invoice on the spot. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He hit us with a $50,000 penalty for the mass walkout, the breached timeline, and the ruined catering. $50,000, Dad." He dragged his hands through his disheveled hair, pacing the small porch like a caged animal. "We spent the entire night on the phone with lawyers." Ethan pressed on his voice, climbing to a frantic pitch. "We reached Natalie's uncle, who handles corporate litigation. He said, 'We have a rock-solid case against you. You verbally agreed to fund this wedding. You deliberately sabotaged a contracted event. You are fully liable for the financial fallout. We are not leaving this porch until you write us a check for $50,000 to cover the penalty you caused.'" Natalie crossed her arms, nodding sharply. "You are going to pay for every single penny, Gerald," she demanded, her tone thick with arrogant entitlement. "And you are going to pay for a public relations firm to repair the damage you did to my reputation. If you refuse, we will drag you into court and expose you as a senile, abusive old man. We will drain every last dime of your pathetic little savings account. You are going to regret the day you ever crossed me." I stood there and let their threats roll over me like water off stone. They were entirely predictable. Intimidation and legal posturing were the shields they hid behind to avoid any shred of accountability. They were certain they could bully an old man into opening his checkbook to clean up their own mess. They believed they held the advantage because they had spoken to a lawyer. I turned around slowly, leaving the front door open behind me. Ethan and Natalie exchanged a look of smug satisfaction, convinced they had broken something in me. They assumed I was heading back inside to find my checkbook. I crossed to the small entryway table, where I kept my correspondence and important papers. I picked up a thick manila folder that my attorney Graham Hadley had couriered to my house late the previous night. I carried it back to the front door and stepped out onto the porch, holding it in my right hand. "I am not writing you a check, Ethan," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, measured register. Ethan stepped toward me, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Then we will see you in court." "Dad," he said, "you are going to lose everything." I opened the manila folder deliberately and drew out a thick packet of crisp, legally binding documents. I held it out toward him. Ethan snatched the papers from my hand, eyes blazing. "What is this?" he snapped, looking down at the cover page. "And that is the master service agreement and venue contract for the Ridgemont Country Club," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on his. "Turn to the last page, Ethan. Find the signature line." Ethan flipped roughly through the heavy pages, breathing fast and shallow. Natalie leaned over his shoulder, scanning the dense legal text. They reached the final page. There at the bottom was the signature block for the corporate entity that owned the country club, the catering group, and the entire hospitality staff. Printed clearly beneath the signature line was the title of Chief Executive Officer Gerald Callahan. Ethan's face drained of color instantly. The furious red flush across his cheeks vanished, replaced by a sickly pale gray. His hands began to shake, the heavy paper rattling audibly in the still morning air. He stared at my printed name and my signature, reading it over and over, as though his mind was flatly refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. "I do not understand," Natalie whispered, the arrogant edge completely gone from her voice. Her gaze moved from the contract to my face and back again. "Gerald Callahan. That is you. How is your name on the ownership contract for this country club?" "Because I own it." "Natalie," I said, my tone flat and absolute. "I own the venue. I own the catering company. I own the employment contracts of the 45 staff members you insulted. My private holding company has held that property for over a decade. I did not merely pay the $80,000 invoice for your wedding. I own the corporation that issued it." Ethan looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He had the look of a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was bracing for the ground to arrive. "Dad!" He finally choked out, his voice barely above a terrified whisper. "You own the Ridgemont Country Club." "I do." "Ethan," I confirmed, crossing my arms over my chest. "Which brings us back to your demand for $50,000. You are absolutely right about the penalty. The general manager was acting on my direct instructions when he issued that invoice last night. But you seem to be fundamentally confused about how this transaction works. I am not paying the $50,000 penalty for the ruined event. I am the one charging you the $50,000 penalty." Natalie stumbled backward as though she had taken a physical blow. Both hands flew to cover her mouth, a muffled gasp escaping between her fingers. "You breached the code of conduct in the venue agreement when you verbally abused my staff." I continued, stepping forward and forcing Ethan to retreat a step down the porch stairs. "You caused significant financial damage through wasted inventory and operational disruption. The invoice you are holding is not a threat, Ethan. It is a legal debt owed to my corporation. And since you boasted so loudly to all your wealthy guests about funding this wedding yourself with your magnificent cryptocurrency windfall, I expect payment in full within 30 days. Ethan's legs seemed to buckle beneath him. He grabbed the wooden porch railing to keep himself upright, the heavy contract slipping from his fingers and scattering across the concrete steps. "Oh, Dad, please," he begged, every trace of arrogance scrubbed from his voice. "We do not have $50,000. We are completely broke. We put the entire honeymoon on credit cards. If you collect this debt, you will bankrupt us." I looked at the son who had threatened to let me rot in a cheap house. I looked at the woman who had demanded I sit hidden in the back row of her wedding. I felt nothing at all. "Then I suggest you call Natalie's uncle and retain that corporate lawyer," I said quietly. "Because the debt is real, and my collection agency does not negotiate." I stepped back inside my modest home and pushed the heavy wooden door shut behind me. I turned the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click, sealing them out in the cold morning air. I walked back to my kitchen, picked up my mug of black coffee, and took a long, unhurried sip. It tasted exceptional. I stood at the kitchen window, holding my mug, and looked out through the sheer curtains. The heavy door between us was locked, but the scene unfolding on my front lawn needed no audio for me to grasp the full magnitude of their collapse. Ethan was pacing in tight, frantic circles, kicking at the loose gravel near the driveway. Natalie stood frozen on the concrete steps. Then slowly she knelt down, her sweatpants brushing the cold stone, and began gathering the scattered pages of the contract Ethan had dropped. Her hands were shaking so badly the heavy parchment fluttered like dry leaves caught in a breeze. I watched her assemble the pages and turn to the final sheet. Even through the glass, I could see the exact moment her reality cracked apart. She stared at the signature block, her eyes tracing my name over and over. Then she looked up at my modest single-story house, and then over at my battered 12-year-old pickup sitting in the driveway. The cognitive dissonance was dismantling her from the inside. The man she had ordered to the back row, the man she had mocked for looking like a janitor, was the undisputed sovereign of the elite world she had spent her entire life clawing toward. Natalie rose to her feet, clutching the contract against her chest. Her face was drained of all color. The arrogant sneer she wore like a crown was entirely gone, replaced by a mask of hollow terror. She moved down the steps toward Ethan, holding the paper out as though it were something dangerous. Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face her, I could catch the muffled sound of their voices through the thick window glass. Natalie was speaking in rapid, frantic bursts, pointing at the signature and then gesturing back at my house. Ethan suddenly erupted. He tore the contract from her hands and flung it onto the wet grass. He grabbed the sides of his head and screamed something up at the morning sky. The illusion he had so carefully constructed for his new bride was finished. He had spent 2 years persuading Natalie he was a self-made cryptocurrency genius who bankrolled their lavish life together. Now she knew the truth. She had married a broke, desperate fraud who was entirely dependent on the very father he had allowed her to humiliate. I decided I was not quite done. The invoice Patrick had handed them the night before was only the preliminary penalty for the walkout. It did not account for the physical destruction they had left behind. I set my coffee mug on the counter, unlocked the front door, and pushed it open one final time. The sudden noise made them both flinch. Ethan spun around his face, contorted with venomous, panicked fury. "Are you happy now, Dad?" he screamed, marching to the edge of my lawn, but stopping just short of the porch steps. "You proved your point. You showed everyone you are the big boss. You ruined my marriage before it even started. Natalie is packing her bags. Are you proud of yourself?" I stepped out onto the porch and drew a small folded piece of paper from my shirt pocket. "I am not interested in your marriage, Ethan," I replied, my voice cutting cleanly through his frantic yelling. "I am interested in property damage. The general manager had completed a full inventory of the ballroom after you and your guests were finally cleared out. I thought you would want the itemized list before my collection agency officially serves you." Natalie took a hesitant step forward, her eyes wide and frightened. "What property damage?" she asked, her voice trembling so badly the words barely held together. "We did not break anything, Gerald. We just stood there in the dark." "You did not," I said, looking directly at her pale face. "But your angry, hungry guests certainly did. When the lights went out and the panic took hold, several tables were knocked over. That includes 9 shattered, hand-blown glass centerpieces imported from Czech Republic. It includes 4 damaged antique mahogany dining chairs. And it includes the total loss of the premium catering order. 250 portions of prime, dry-aged ribeye left to spoil on the prep tables, because you ordered my executive chef out of the kitchen." Ethan grabbed his own hair, pulling at it in sheer frustration. "You cannot bill us for food that your staff abandoned," he yelled, spittle flying from his lips. "You ordered them to walk out." "I ordered them to vacate a hostile work environment." I corrected him, my tone without mercy. "An environment you created when your wife physically assaulted a waitress. According to the master service agreement you signed, the client bears full responsibility for the cost of all perishable inventory when an event is terminated due to client misconduct. The $50,000 penalty was merely the breach of contract fine. The ruined food, the damaged glassware, and the hazard pay for my cleaning crew brings your total personal debt to $82,000. Natalie let out a choked, sobbing gasp. $82,000! She repeated, staring at Ethan with an expression of pure loathing. "You told me you were rich, Ethan. You told me you had millions sitting in offshore accounts. Tell him to take it from your investments. Tell him to pull it from your portfolio, right now." Ethan did not look at her. He could not look at her. He fixed his eyes on the ground, his chest rising and falling with deep, ragged breaths. "I do not have a portfolio," he muttered, his voice breaking apart. "I do not have offshore accounts, Natalie. I do not have anything." He paid for the wedding. He paid for everything. Natalie stared at him as though she were looking at a complete stranger. Her entire existence had been built around the pursuit of wealth and status, and she had just learned she had married a man who possessed neither. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice soaked in contempt. "You are nothing. You are a broke, pathetic loser living off your father's money." Ethan snapped. The shame and the financial terror finally boiled over into blind, violent rage. He turned away from Natalie and let out a guttural scream. He stormed toward my driveway and drove a vicious kick into the front bumper of my battered 12-year-old pickup. The heavy steel barely registered the blow, but Ethan howled in pain, stumbling backward and clutching his foot. He looked up at me with tears of pure hatred streaming down his face. "I will destroy you!" he screamed, hobbling on one foot. "I do not care how much money you have. You cannot do this to your own blood. I will find a way to make you pay for this. I will burn your life to the ground." I watched him throw his pathetic tantrum with complete indifference. You cannot burn down a house when you do not even own the matches, Ethan, I said quietly. You have 30 days to remit payment to the holding company. If you fail to pay my lawyers, we'll place liens on everything you own. Now, get off my property before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing and vandalism. Ethan glared at me, chest heaving, but he knew he was beaten. He limped toward the passenger side of Natalie's car without another word. Natalie did not wait for him to settle in. The moment his hand touched the door handle, she hit the automatic locks. The sharp click echoed through the quiet street. Ethan stared at her through the glass, mouthing something, but Natalie simply put the car in reverse and pulled away fast, leaving her new husband standing alone on the pavement. I watched Ethan yank his phone from his pocket and frantically try to call a rideshare. Then I turned around, walked back inside, and locked the door behind me. I moved over to the entryway table to sort through the rest of my morning mail. A thick envelope from my primary bank was near the top of the stack. I tore it open expecting a routine statement. What I found instead was a formal notice regarding a second mortgage taken out against my late wife's estate. I stared at the signature line. It bore my name, but it was not my handwriting. What had begun as a civil dispute had just crossed into federal criminal territory. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed the direct line for Graham Hadley. We had work to do. The silence that settled over the house after I locked the front door was absolute. I stood in the narrow hallway and listened to the faint sound of Ethan's footsteps retreating down the driveway. He had no car and no wife to carry him home. He was completely alone with the catastrophic weight of his own arrogance. I drew a slow breath and let the quiet of my home settle around me. For years, I had allowed my peace to be picked apart by his endless demands and his constant hunger for validation. I had let Natalie bring her corrosive energy into my life because I believed it was the cost of keeping my son near. That obligation was now permanently dissolved. I walked to the small oak table by the entryway, where the morning mail sat in a tidy stack. I set my coffee mug down on a coaster. The ceramic touched the wood with a soft clink. I lifted the envelopes and began sorting through them. Most were routine junk mail utility bills, but near the bottom of the pile sat a thick, heavy envelope from the personal banking institution I use for my private finances. Not the bank that managed my corporate holding company, but the local branch where Eleanor and I had opened our very first joint checking account more than 40 years ago. The return address was printed in bold red ink, flagging an urgent notice from the lending and mortgage department. I frowned. I had not taken out a personal loan in 3 decades. I owned my home outright. I owned my vehicles outright. My corporate acquisitions ran through an entirely separate financial entity managed by a dedicated team of accountants. There was no reason on earth for the personal mortgage department to be reaching me by certified mail with an urgent notice. I slid my thumb under the envelope flap and tore it open. The thick parchment slid out into my hands. I unfolded it and read. The header identified the letter as a formal notice of approval and funds disbursement for a secondary mortgage. I read the words a second time, to be certain my eyes were not playing tricks on me. The bank was confirming that a line of credit for $200,000 had been fully approved and the funds transferred to an external escrow account. My heart began to beat in a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I lowered my gaze to the property address listed as collateral for this loan. It was not the house I was standing in. It was the address of a sprawling tract of undeveloped land and an old farmhouse in the next county over. That property was the physical embodiment of my late wife's legacy. Eleanor had inherited that estate from her grandparents. We had spent the first 5 years of our marriage restoring that old farmhouse with our own hands. It was where we escaped on weekends away from the noise of the city. Before Eleanor passed, she made me promise to keep that land in the family. It was a sacred piece of our shared history, entirely separate from my corporate holdings. It was the single thing I valued above any holding company or bank account. And now, according to the document in my hands, a $200,000 lien had been placed against it. I turned to the second page of the packet. It was a photocopy of the finalized loan agreement. My eyes dropped immediately to the bottom right corner of the page to the signature block. There, written in dark blue ink, was my name, Gerald Callahan. I studied the signature for a long time. It was a convincing imitation. The slope of the capital G and the sharp, deliberate cross of the letter H were nearly identical to the way I signed my corporate documents. But it was not my handwriting. The loops were slightly too hurried without the steady, even pressure I naturally applied when writing. and the date entered beside the forged signature was exactly 14 days ago. I closed my eyes and let my memory reach back 2 weeks. Before we go any further, I want you to sit with what is coming. What I'm about to share is the moment I understood how far the betrayal truly reached and how long it had been quietly growing right under my own roof. I have to ask you this: if you discovered that someone you had welcomed into your home had been moving against you in secret, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait until every piece of proof was in your hands? It was a Tuesday evening. Ethan had shown up at the house without warning. He claimed his printer had broken down, and he needed to run off some urgent documents for a presentation at his firm. I had welcomed him in, offered him dinner, and pointed him toward the computer in my home office. I went into the kitchen to brew a fresh pot of coffee. I was gone perhaps 20 minutes. When I came back carrying 2 steaming mugs, Ethan had looked up with a sudden guilty start. He had shoved a file drawer shut, the exact drawer where I stored the original deeds and tax documents for all my personal properties. He laughed it off, claimed he had dropped a pen, but he was sweating. He packed up his briefcase quickly after that and left without touching his coffee. The pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. Ethan had not come over to print anything. He had come to steal the deed information for Eleanor's estate. He had taken those property details, forged my signature on a loan application, and leveraged the one thing I held sacred to secure a massive line of credit. I looked back down at the document. The escrow account where the $200,000 had been transferred was registered to a title company, one that handled luxury real estate transactions in the city. He had stolen $200,000 from his own father to fund the down payment on the luxury high-rise condo where he and Natalie currently lived. Natalie had demanded a home that matched her elite aesthetic. Ethan, desperate to sustain the fiction that he was a wealthy cryptocurrency investor, had resorted to robbing his own family to purchase her loyalty. He had mortgaged the land his mother cherished simply to impress a woman who regarded him as nothing more than a status symbol. He had put at risk the property where Eleanor and I had built our lives together, all to maintain a wretched, hollow facade. I set the documents carefully on the oak table. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl the coffee mug against the wall. The anger from the night before at the country club had been a hot, burning fire. This was something entirely different. This was ice. A freezing absolute zero fury that settled deep into my bones and stayed there. Walking out of a wedding reception was a family dispute. Refusing to pay an $80,000 penalty was a lesson in financial accountability. But forging a name on a mortgage document was neither a tantrum nor a misunderstanding. It was a felony. Ethan had committed identity theft. He had committed wire fraud. He had defrauded a federally insured banking institution. He had crossed a line that no apology or tearful confession could uncross. He had set in motion a sequence of events that carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. My son had looked me in the eye, eaten food from my kitchen, and stolen $200,000 right out from under me. I moved to the living room window and looked out at the empty street. The sun was bright, but the world felt entirely different than it had 10 minutes ago. I understood then that Ethan had fundamentally miscalculated. He believed I was a soft, sentimental old man who would ultimately bury his mistakes to protect the family name. He assumed that even if I discovered the forged loan, I would quietly pay it off to spare everyone the scandal. He thought my love for him would override my respect for the law and my reverence for his mother's memory. He was completely wrong. I built an empire in an industry populated by sharks and predators. I survived in that world because I never let sentiment cloud my judgment when a crime had been committed. Ethan was no longer simply a disrespectful son. He was a hostile party who had attacked my assets and violated the sanctity of my home. I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I landed on the private number for Graham Hadley. Graham was the senior partner at the most aggressive corporate litigation firm in the state, my personal attorney, my corporate counsel, and a man who had built his career on systematically dismantling the affairs of people who tried to defraud my holding company. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. The line rang twice before his deep, measured voice came through. "Good morning, Gerald," Graham said, his tone professional and sharp. "I did not expect to hear from you today. I figured you would still be recovering from the wedding." "There is nothing to recover from, Graham," I replied, keeping my voice level and cold. "But I need you to clear whatever you have scheduled for the rest of the morning. We have a serious escalation on our hands." "What kind of escalation?" Graham asked, the easy tone gone in an instant, replaced by the focused intensity of a man catching a scent. I am looking at a formal notice from Heritage Trust Bank, I said, walking back to the table and studying the forged signature. Ethan took out a $200,000 secondary mortgage on Eleanor's estate. He forged my signature on the application and had the funds wired to a title company to purchase the condo he and Natalie live in. There was a long pause on the other end. When Graham spoke again, his voice had shed every trace of warmth. Gerald, that is identity theft and major bank fraud. That is a federal crime with serious time attached. If we report this, law enforcement will be drawn in. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed down this road with your own son? I looked at the forged signature one final time. I thought about Ethan standing on my porch, threatening to expose me as a senile, abusive old man. I thought about Natalie screaming at the waitress. I thought about the sheer, unfiltered greed that had consumed the boy I raised. I am absolutely certain, Graham, I said, my voice carrying through the empty house. I am heading to your office right now. I want a complete forensic audit of Ethan's entire financial life. Every credit card, every bank account, every loan he has ever touched. He wants to swim in deep water. It is time we let him find out how deep it goes. I did not change out of my work clothes. I did not put on a suit to impress anyone in the sleek glass towers of the financial district. I folded the forged mortgage documents, tucked them into the inner pocket of my jacket, and walked out to my pickup. The drive downtown was a blur of gray concrete and morning traffic. My mind was focused, cold and sharp. For 34 years, I had operated on the belief that my primary duty was to shield my son from the harder edges of the world. Now, my primary duty was to protect my late wife's legacy from him. I pulled into the subterranean parking garage beneath Pinnacle Tower. The valet attendant, a young man who usually parked imported luxury sedans, accepted my keys with a polite nod. He knew exactly who I was. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was silent. When the polished steel doors opened, I walked into the sprawling minimalist reception area of Hadley and Associates. The walls were dressed in dark walnut paneling, an abstract modern art that likely cost more than most people's homes. The receptionist recognized me the moment I stepped in. She did not ask about an appointment. She rose from her chair, smiled with quiet deference, and gestured toward the main hallway. "Mr. Hadley is expecting you, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice kept low. I moved past the waiting area and walked directly toward the heavy double doors at the corridor's end. I pushed them open and entered Graham Hadley's office. Graham was standing at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out across the city skyline. He was 55 years old with iron gray hair swept cleanly back and a tailored charcoal suit that fit him like armor. He turned as I came in. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes were razor sharp, reading my posture and expression in a single glance. He crossed to his large mahogany desk and gestured toward one of the leather guest chairs. "You do not come downtown on a Sunday morning unless a building has burned down or someone has declared war. Gerald," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. "Which one is it?" I did not sit. I walked to the desk, reached into my jacket, and drew out the folded bank documents. I dropped them onto the polished surface. They slid across the wood and came to rest directly in front of him. "Both Graham," I said. Graham picked up the documents and began to read. He did not rush. He read every line on the first page, then turned to the signature block on the second. He held his gaze on the forged signature for several long seconds before setting the papers back on the desk and folding his hands together. "I assume," he began, his tone perfectly neutral, "that you did not authorize a $200,000 secondary mortgage on Eleanor's estate." "I did not," I confirmed. "Ethan forged my signature. He used the proceeds to secure a line of credit for the down payment on the luxury condo he now shares with his new wife. He got into my private filing cabinet 2 weeks ago, while I was in the kitchen making coffee." Graham leaned back in his chair. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. Not amusement, but the expression of a predator who has just been handed the keys to the enclosure. He tapped one finger against his lips, working through the angles. "Wire fraud," he murmured almost to himself. "Identity theft, defrauding a federally insured financial institution, forgery of legal documents." He looked back up at me, eyes glittering with a sharp, dangerous focus. "Your son has been very busy, Gerald. What is our immediate legal exposure?" I asked, keeping the conversation strictly operational. "None," Graham replied without an hesitation. We file a formal affidavit of forgery with the bank by noon tomorrow. That freezes the account and triggers their internal fraud investigation. We simultaneously file a police report to establish the identity theft on record. The bank will move to revoke the line of credit and demand the return of the disbursed funds from the title company. If the title company has already forwarded the money to the seller, the condo purchase collapses. If the transaction has already closed, the bank will place an immediate lien on the property and begin foreclosure proceedings against Ethan. He lifted a silver pen from the desk and began turning it between his fingers. The civil liability is entirely his. The criminal liability is entirely his. He has built himself a perfect self-executing trap. I crossed to the window and looked down at the small cars threading through the streets below. I need to understand the full scope of his financial situation, Graham. If he was desperate enough to forge a mortgage against his mother's estate, he is concealing other things. I want to know exactly what I am dealing with before I move on him directly. Graham nodded and pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Rebecca," he said, addressing his senior paralegal, "I need a comprehensive forensic audit initiated immediately. The subject is Ethan Callahan. I want personal bank accounts, credit card histories, investment portfolios, and any outstanding loans. I want to know where he buys his coffee and who holds the deed to his car. Pull everything. We are going scorched earth." He released the button and turned back to me. "We will have the preliminary data by tomorrow evening, Gerald, but you need to brace yourself. A man who steals from his own father to buy a luxury condo is not managing his finances well. The audit is going to expose a significant deficit. We are likely looking at severe outstanding debts, possibly private lenders as well." "I am prepared," I said, my voice steady. "Find the bottom of it, Graham. I want to see exactly how deep the rot runs. And I want everything documented, every transaction, every lie, every dollar he stole. When I face him, I want a mountain of proof he cannot argue with." "Consider it done," Graham said, sliding the forged documents into a secure red folder. He rose from behind the desk and walked toward me with his hand extended. "I am sorry it has come to this, Gerald. I know how much you love that boy." I shook his hand, grip firm. "I did love him, Graham, but the man who forged that signature is a stranger to me, and I do not let strangers steal from my family." I turned and walked out of the downtown office, the heavy double doors swinging shut behind me. The initial shock of the betrayal had fully dissolved, replaced by a cool, methodical determination. Ethan believed he was a brilliant manipulator, that he could outmaneuver a man who had spent 40 years constructing an empire from nothing. He was about to learn a very hard lesson about the difference between performing power and actually possessing it. I rode the elevator back down to the garage, climbed into my battered 12-year-old pickup, and pulled out into the city, ready to take apart my son's counterfeit life, one piece at a time. I was in the kitchen pouring my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang, 3 sharp, impatient bursts in quick succession. I did not hurry. I walked down the hall at the same measured pace I had kept all week. I had spent the past 2 days working with Graham, assembling every financial record, medical document, and security footage file we would need. I had anticipated an escalation, but I did not expect it to land on my front porch quite this soon. I opened the door and found Ethan standing there in a sharp, tailored suit, looking nothing like the panicked, shattered man who had kicked my pickup just days before. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture rigid, projecting a manufactured air of authority. Beside him stood a woman I had never seen. She wore a sensible gray blazer and carried a thick leather clipboard. Her expression was composed, but her eyes moved over me with quiet appraisal, taking in my work shirt and worn jeans. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice drenched in exaggerated, sickly, sweet concern. "I brought someone to see you. This is Ms. Delacroix from Adult Protective Services. We just want to talk." I looked at Ms. Delacroix, then back at Ethan. I did not step aside. I held my position in the doorway, one hand resting casually on the brass handle. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit, Ms. Delacroix?" I asked, my tone polite but unyielding. Ms. Delacroix stepped slightly forward and opened her clipboard. "Mr. Callahan, we received a concerning report about your recent behavior," she said, her voice measured and professional. "Your son has documented several incidents, erratic actions, sudden financial hostility, and aggressive outbursts surrounding a recent family event. We are here to conduct a preliminary welfare check." Ethan sighed heavily, shaking his head as though carrying the weight of the world. "Dad, please," he said, sounding like an actor who had memorized his lines. You have not been yourself lately. Canceling the wedding venue, demanding absurd sums of money, locking me out of the house. You are confused. I only want to help you before you hurt yourself or lose everything. I let his words hang in the morning air and said nothing for a moment. The sheer audacity of his strategy was almost impressive. He was not merely trying to escape the consequences of his forgery. He was attempting a hostile takeover of my entire life. If he could persuade Adult Protective Services that I was suffering from serious cognitive decline, he could petition a judge for medical power of attorney. With that authority, he could seize control of my accounts, drain my assets, and bury the evidence of his own crimes. He was trying to have me declared incompetent in order to save himself. Ms. Delacroix, I said, shifting my attention entirely away from my son, I understand you have a duty to perform, but I must inform you that the man standing beside you is currently the subject of an active federal investigation for identity theft wire fraud and the forgery of a $200,000 mortgage document. Ethan's face twitched his mask of concern, slipping for a fraction of a second. Ms. Delacroix frowned her pen, hovering over the clipboard. Sir, she said carefully, those are very serious allegations. My primary concern today, however, is your cognitive health. Your son has indicated you have been experiencing paranoid delusions regarding your finances. They are not delusions, Ms. Delacroix, I replied evenly. They are documented facts. I stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing toward the living room. Please come in, both of you. I think we should resolve this right now. Ethan hesitated, throwing a nervous glance down the street, but Ms. Delacroix walked past him into the house, and he had no choice but to follow. I guided them into the living room, where I had deliberately left several manila folders arranged on the coffee table. I did not offer them seats. I moved to the table and picked up the first folder. Ethan made his move to control the narrative the moment we were inside. You see, Ms. Delacroix, he said, gesturing at the folders. He is fixated on paperwork. He is convinced everyone is stealing from him. It is classic paranoia. I handed the first folder directly to the social worker. Ms. Delacroix, please review the opening document, I said. It is a thorough cognitive and neurological evaluation completed just 3 weeks ago by Dr. Harmon Beckett, Chief of Neurology at Vanderbilt Medical Center. It was a mandatory requirement for renewing my corporate life insurance policy. You will find that I scored in the 99th percentile for memory retention, executive function, and logical reasoning. I am entirely competent. Ms. Delacroix scanned the medical report, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the prominent doctor's signature. I lifted the second folder and passed it to her. That is a certified copy of a fraud affidavit filed yesterday with Heritage Trust Bank. It lays out a secondary mortgage taken out against my late wife's estate. I did not sign that document. My son did. He used those funds to purchase a luxury condominium. Ethan's face went pale. He lurched forward, his voice climbing toward panic. That is a lie, he shouted, jabbing a finger in my direction. He is fabricating all of this to destroy me. Do you see how vindictive he is? This is precisely what I have been telling you. I reached into my pocket and set a small digital tablet on the table, then pressed play. Ms. Delacroix, I said quietly, you mentioned erratic behavior at a family event. What you are about to watch is security footage from the Ridgemont Country Club, recorded the night of my son's wedding reception. The cameras carry high-definition audio. The screen lit up, showing the grand ballroom. The footage caught the exact moment Natalie crossed the room toward my table. The audio was unmistakably clear. The social worker sat in silence as Natalie screamed at me, calling me a janitor and demanding I leave the building. She watched Ethan standing at the bar, deliberately ignoring every word of the abuse. And she watched me calmly rise from my seat, button my jacket, and direct the entire staff to clear the premises. I paused the footage and met Ms. Delacroix's gaze. Does that look like the conduct of a man lost to dementia? I asked. Or does it look like a business owner invoking a breach of contract clause after being verbally assaulted by a hostile client? Ms. Delacroix lowered her clipboard. She looked at the neurological evaluation, then at the fraud affidavit, and finally at Ethan. The professional neutrality that had held her expression collapsed into a sharp, condemning stare. Mr. Callahan, she said, addressing Ethan, her voice ice cold, filing a false report with Adult Protective Services in an attempt to interfere with a financial investigation is a serious criminal offense. Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was completely cornered. The story he had so methodically built was dismantled in under 5 minutes. He stared at the folders in her hands, then up at me, his eyes hollow with a trapped, desperate terror. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Do not do this." "You did this, Ethan," I replied, my voice steady in the stillness of the living room. "You brought a government official into my home to strip away my independence. You thought you could use my age as a weapon against me." I turned back to Miss Delacroix. "Are we finished here?" "We are absolutely finished, sir," she said, returning the folders to me. "I apologize for the intrusion. This case will be closed immediately." She turned to Ethan. "I strongly suggest you retain a very good lawyer, Mr. Callahan." She walked out the front door without a backward glance. Ethan stood alone in the center of my living room, the silence pressing down on him like something with weight. He had played his strongest card and it had missed entirely. "Get out of my house, Ethan," I said, pointing toward the door, "and do not ever come back." Earlier, I had directed Miss Delacroix to take a seat on the floral-patterned sofas at the center of my living room. Ethan had immediately claimed the armchair nearest to her, leaning in with his hands clasped in a studied display of filial concern. He had practiced this. He watched me with wide, sorrowful eyes, shaking his head in slow, theatrical grief, as though witnessing a man's decline in real time. I did not sit. I crossed to the heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner, the same cabinet Ethan had rifled through 2 weeks prior to forge the mortgage documents. I pulled open the top drawer, withdrew 3 thick manila folders, and carried them back to the center of the room. I set them on the glass coffee table directly in front of the social worker. Ethan reached for the first folder, and I placed my hand firmly on top of it. "These are for the state investigator, Ethan," I said, my voice level. "You forfeited the right to review my personal documents the moment you forged my signature to acquire a luxury condominium." Ms. Delacroix frowned slightly, her gaze moving between us. She drew the first folder toward her and opened it. "Ms. Delacroix," I said, standing straight with my hands clasped at my back, "your report states that I am suffering from severe cognitive decline and paranoia. Inside that folder, you will find a comprehensive neurological and psychiatric evaluation conducted exactly 18 days ago by Dr. Harmon Beckett, Chief of Neurology at the State Medical Board. It was a mandatory condition for renewing my corporate executive life insurance policy." Ethan let out a loud scoff, dismissing it with a wave. "Doctors can be fooled, Ms. Delacroix," he cut in, his voice thick with manufactured exasperation. "My father can hold himself together for an hour inside a clinic, but you were not at that wedding." He was completely unhinged. Ms. Delacroix did not look at Ethan. She was reading, her eyes moving steadily through the detailed paragraphs. I watched her shift from polished skepticism to genuine attention. She noted the cognitive test scores, the brain scan results, and the physician's unequivocal conclusion that my mental faculties ranked in the top 1% for my age group. She closed the folder and looked up at me with a perceptibly different regard. I tapped the second folder. "The report also asserts that I suffer from paranoid delusions concerning my finances and that I cut off my son without rational cause. Please open the second file." Ms. Delacroix opened it. Inside sat a certified copy of my most recent corporate tax return, alongside the operating agreement for my private holding company. Ethan craned forward, trying to read the figures on the heavy parchment. The moment a glimpse of the gross annual revenue reached him, the color drained entirely from his face. He sank back into the armchair as though something had knocked the air out of him. "You will see, Ms. Delacroix," I continued, my voice carrying through the room, "that I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of a hospitality and real estate enterprise generating tens of millions of dollars each year. I manage a board of directors. I oversee acquisitions. My finances are not delusions, they are meticulously audited by a team of certified public accountants. I cut off my son's allowance because I discovered he was spending my money to sustain a lavish counterfeit lifestyle while standing aside as his new wife humiliated me in public." "That is a lie," Ethan snapped, launching himself out of the armchair. "He is twisting everything. Natalie was under pressure because of the wedding, and he blew it completely out of proportion to punish us. He shut down the entire venue because he threw a senile temper tantrum." I set down the second folder and lifted the third item from the table, not a folder, but a sleek digital tablet. I unlocked the screen and placed it directly in Ms. Delacroix's hands. "Ms. Delacroix," I said quietly, You have been asked to determine whether I suffered an erratic psychotic break at the Ridgemont Country Club. I paused. I own the Ridgemont Country Club. That tablet holds the high-definition security footage from the main ballroom and the catering kitchen. The audio is crystal clear. Please press play. Ms. Delacroix tapped the screen. The living room filled with the sounds of the wedding reception. The footage showed me seated quietly at a table in the far back corner. Then, Natalie swept onto the screen. Her shrill, vicious voice poured through the speakers. Miss Delacroix watched as Natalie screamed at me, calling me a cheap, bitter old man and a janitor who had wandered in off the street. She watched Ethan standing at the bar, a glass of scotch in hand, deliberately angling away while his father was being publicly berated. Then the footage showed what I did. Ms. Delacroix watched me calmly set down my napkin, rise from my seat button, my jacket, and tell Natalie that respect is earned, not bought. She watched me walk into the kitchen without a single raised voice or erratic motion, and instruct my general manager to legally terminate the event on the grounds of client hostility. I paused the video. "Does that look like a man unraveling from dementia, Ms. Delacroix?" I asked. "Or does it look like a corporate executive enforcing a breach of contract after being verbally assaulted on his own property?" Ms. Delacroix set the tablet down on the coffee table. She closed the folders one by one and stacked them in a neat pile. The composed expression she had carried through the door was gone entirely. She turned slowly toward Ethan. The look she gave him was one of pure, unvarnished contempt. Ethan swallowed hard, retreating until the backs of his knees found the armchair. "Ms. Delacroix, please," he stammered, a nervous sweat rising on his forehead. "You have to understand, he is manipulating the Mr. Callahan." Ms. Delacroix said, her voice sharp and cutting cold, severing his sentence cleanly. "My agency exists to shield vulnerable elderly citizens from exploitation and abuse. We are severely underfunded, and we carry hundreds of urgent cases involving people who genuinely need our intervention. You brought me into this home under false pretenses, intending to weaponize my authority against a perfectly healthy man." She gathered her thick leather clipboard and rose to her feet, towering over him in every sense that mattered. "You attempted to use adult protective services to lay the groundwork for a fraudulent medical power of attorney. That is not simply a waste of state resources. It is a crime. I am closing this case effective immediately. Beyond that, I am entering a formal notation in our system documenting your malicious intent. Should you ever contact our agency again, I will personally refer your conduct to the district attorney's office for filing a false government report." Ethan's mouth opened, but whatever lie he had readied dissolved under the sheer authority in her voice. He dropped his gaze to his expensive leather shoes, thoroughly defeated. Ms. Delacroix turned to me and offered a brief, respectful nod. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Callahan," she said. "It is evident you have everything firmly under control." "Thank you for your time, Ms. Delacroix," I replied, walking with her toward the front hallway. I opened the door and let the cool morning air move through the house. Ms. Delacroix descended the front steps, got into her state-issued sedan, and drove away without a backward glance. I left the front door standing wide open and turned back toward the living room. Ethan was still rooted near the coffee table, staring down at the folders. He looked diminished, small, hollow, and entirely without options. His final desperate gambit had collapsed, and now he was alone in the room with the man he had tried to bring down. The rest of that day passed in a kind of suspended stillness. I moved through the house, carrying out small tasks with deliberate mechanical care. I watered the plants along the back patio. I sorted through the tools in my garage. I even put together a simple dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables, though I had little real interest in eating. I was waiting for the next blow to land. The silence was no longer restful. It had taken on the dense, taut quality that gathers before a serious storm. Uncovering Ethan's forgery had fundamentally redrawn the map of my life. He was no longer simply an ungrateful son. He was a criminal adversary. It was just past 8:00 in the evening when my mobile phone finally broke the quiet. Graham Hadley's private number lit up the screen. I folded the dish towel over the kitchen counter and picked up the call. "Good evening, Graham," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Tell me you have something solid." "Good evening," Graham replied, his tone stripped of any pleasantry. His voice was clipped sharp and focused entirely on the matter at hand. "The forensic accounting team has been running non-stop since you left the office. We have engaged the fraud protocols with Heritage Trust Bank. They have officially frozen the escrow account tied to the forged mortgage. Ethan cannot touch those funds. The condo purchase is stalled." "Excellent," I said, allowing myself a measured moment of satisfaction. "That closes off his immediate escape route. What about the audit? Did you reach the bottom of it?" Graham let out a low, humorless sound, less a chuckle than a growl. "Gerald," he said, "we did not just reach the bottom of the barrel. We found an entirely new barrel buried underneath it. Your son's financial position is not merely a shortfall. It is a catastrophic collapse. But that is not the most troubling piece of information we turned up." I leaned against the counter, frowning. "Explain." "Let us start with Ethan." Graham began, the rustling of thick paper audible through the line. "He is completely insolvent. He has maxed out 7 different high-yield credit cards over the past 18 months. He carries approximately $65,000 in unsecured consumer debt on its own. His cryptocurrency holdings, which he broadcasts so loudly, are virtually non-existent. He bought high, sold low, and effectively dismantled his own portfolio just to service the interest on his credit cards. He does not hold a single tangible asset to his name. The luxury car he drives is leased, and he is 3 months behind on the payments." I closed my eyes and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose. He had constructed an entire life out of smoke and pretense. He had strained desperately to project the image of a polished, successful entrepreneur while quietly drowning in debt. He had forged a mortgage on his mother's estate because it was quite literally the only card he had left to play to keep the fiction alive. "It is pathetic," I said quietly, "but it is exactly what I anticipated. What is the alarming part?" "Graham Duan, the alarming part concerns his new bride," Graham said, his voice dropping into a measured, serious register. "When my team began tracing the financial flow, we naturally looked at the $80,000 you transferred to Ethan for the wedding expenses. We assumed, given the scale of his debt, that he had likely siphoned a portion to service his credit cards." "Did he?" I asked. "No," Graham replied. "Ethan actually transferred the full $80,000 directly into a joint checking account he had opened with Natalie 3 months earlier. He designated those funds explicitly for wedding vendors. The problem, Gerald, is not how Ethan spent the money. The problem is how Natalie spent it." I straightened my grip, tightening around the phone. "What did she do?" "Natalie was placed in charge of paying the vendors," Graham explained. "She was cutting the checks for the country club, the florist, and the band. But my forensic team identified a serious discrepancy in the outgoing wire transfers. Over the past 8 weeks, Natalie initiated 5 separate transfers out of that joint account. Each one was labeled as miscellaneous vendor fees or administrative deposits, but none of them went to any wedding vendor, Gerald." "Where did they go?" I demanded, my pulse picking up. "They went to a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands." Graham said, the words landing like something physical. "An account registered under the name Natalie Ashford, her maiden name. She systematically embezzled $25,000 of your money right out from under Ethan's nose." The kitchen seemed to shift beneath me. I stood staring at the dark window, turning the sheer weight of the deception over in my mind. Natalie had not simply married Ethan for his perceived wealth. She had not merely endured his inflated lies because she believed him to be a self-made success. She had been actively stealing from him before they ever reached the altar. She had recognized him as a desperate, easily handled fool, and she had moved immediately to siphon funds into her own private safety net. She was embezzling from the wedding account. I said, the full shape of it clicking into place. "Exactly," Graham confirmed. "She skimmed nearly a third of the entire budget you provided. She understood that Ethan was desperate to impress her. She knew he would never examine the vendor invoices closely. He was far too occupied with performing the role of a big shot. She essentially levied herself a $25,000 premium just for showing up at the altar. The cold calculation of it was difficult to absorb. Natalie was not simply an arrogant, entitled bride. She was a financial predator. She had studied my son, identified a weak, insecure man performing wealth he did not possess, and set about extracting everything she could before the inevitable unraveling. And she had financed that extraction, using the very money I had provided Ethan to protect his pride. "Do we have ironclad proof of these transfers, Graham?" I asked, my mind already moving toward the strategic possibilities. "We have the routing numbers, the time-stamped wire confirmations, and the destination account registry." Graham answered without hesitation. "The paper trail is completely airtight. She used a rudimentary shell company structure to move the funds, but my team dismantled it in under an hour. She is not a sophisticated criminal, Gerald. She is simply an opportunistic thief. I began to pace the length of the kitchen, the hardwood floor sounding softly under my step. The shape of things had shifted entirely. Ethan and Natalie were not a united front of entitled elites. They were two cornered frauds secretly stealing from one another. Ethan had forged a mortgage to buy her a condominium. Natalie had embezzled his wedding funds to build herself an exit. They were a house of cards erected on a foundation of mutual betrayal. "Graham," I said, stopping in the center of the room, "this changes everything." "Yes, it does," Graham agreed. "We now hold leverage over both of them. We have Ethan on federal bank fraud and forgery. We have Natalie on wire fraud and embezzlement. We held the means to initiate criminal proceedings against both the bride and the groom. The question is how to deploy it. How do you want to play this, Gerald? Do we hand the files to the district attorney right now and let the police bring them in?" I thought about Ethan standing on my porch threatening to paint me as a senile, abusive old man. I thought about Natalie screaming at the waitress and insisting I be seated in the back corner. I thought about the depth of disrespect, the complete absence of basic human decency from both of them. I did not simply want them arrested. I wanted them utterly dismantled. I wanted them seated across from each other, forced to see exactly what the other had done. "No," I said, my voice settling into a low, controlled edge. "We do not call the police yet. Hand this straight to the authorities, and they will lawyer up, drag it through the courts for years, spin a narrative and point fingers at each other. I want them to tear each other apart in front of me." "What is the play, Gerald?" Graham asked, reading the register in my voice. "Prepare 2 separate dossiers," I instructed. One containing the full evidence of Ethan's forgery and the fraudulent mortgage. The second containing the wire transfer records and the proof of Natalie's offshore embezzlement. I want hard copies of everything documented precisely and verified beyond any dispute. "Understood," Graham said. "And then we invite them to the corporate office." I replied, a cold, grim satisfaction forming somewhere behind my expression. "We get them into the boardroom, we let them believe they are coming in to negotiate a settlement over the venue penalty. We put them in the same room, and then we drop the guillotine." "That is a ruthless strategy, Gerald." Graham observed a note of professional admiration threading through the words. "You are engineering a complete psychological collapse before the legal machinery even begins to move." "They earned it, Graham," I said simply. "Have the dossiers ready by tomorrow morning. I have a phone call to make." I ended the call and set the phone on the counter. The heavy, pressing quiet of the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer the silence of a storm gathering. It was the silence of a trap that had just been set with absolute precision. I picked up the phone again, scrolled to Ethan's number, and pressed call. It was time to invite the bride and groom to their final reception. The following morning, the sky beyond my window was a flat, unrelenting gray, the kind that threatens rain but withholds it. I sat at the kitchen table working through my second cup of coffee. The house was completely still, except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I had spent the last 48 hours methodically dismantling my son's life, and now I was simply waiting for the consequences to reach him. It was precisely 10:00 when my phone rang. I did not need to check the screen. The frantic, uneven vibration against the wood was all the information I needed. I drew a slow, steadying breath before picking it up. "Dad?" The voice on the other end came out as a fractured, desperate whisper. A voice I had not heard since Ethan was a teenager, stripped entirely of its practiced arrogance and false confidence. "I am here, Ethan." I replied, my tone deliberately measured, giving nothing away. "Dad, I need you. I really need you." The words spilled out of him, rushed and unraveling. "Something is happening. Something is very, very wrong. The Bank Heritage Trust, they called me this morning. They said there is a problem with a transaction. They said my accounts are frozen, all of them, and my credit cards are declining everywhere." I listened to his escalating panic with a cold, settled detachment. "What kind of problem with a transaction, Ethan?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "They wouldn't tell me anything over the phone. They only said it is connected to an internal fraud investigation. Dad, I don't know what to do. Natalie is losing her mind. She tried to use her card at a hotel and it was declined. We cannot even buy gas. I am locked out of everything." He pulled a sharp breath, the sound cutting through the line. "Dad, listen to me. I know I messed up. I know I was out of line at the wedding. The things I said, the things Natalie said, it was unacceptable. I was under pressure and I took it out on you. But I need your help. I need you to call the bank. Maybe you can sort this out. If anyone can fix this, it is you." The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Even with financial ruin bearing down on him, his first instinct was to maneuver me into pulling him free. He was attempting to trade a half-hearted apology for a ruined wedding reception against a felony charge. "You want me to call Heritage Trust?" I asked, my voice low and carrying a quiet danger. "Yes, please, Dad. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them whatever they need to hear to unfreeze the accounts. I promise I will pay you back. I will find a better position. I will downsize. I will do whatever it takes. Just please do not let them ruin me." I let the silence extend between us, long and deliberate, allowing his desperation to fill the space. When I finally spoke, each word landed with the weight of something carefully aimed. "I cannot call the bank and tell them it is a mistake, Ethan," I said, my voice echoing in the empty kitchen. "Because it is not a mistake." "What are you talking about?" His voice had shrunk to barely a sound. "I know about the secondary mortgage on your mother's estate, Ethan." I let the words fall one by one, like stones dropping into still water. "I know about the $200,000 line of credit, and I know about the forged signature on the application." The line went completely silent. No breath, no movement, no sound at all. It was the silence of a man who has just understood that every exit is sealed. "I saw the documents, Ethan." I continued, keeping my voice steady and relentless. "You went through my filing cabinet, took the deed information, and forged my name to purchase a luxury condominium for a woman who treats you as nothing more than a source of funds. You did not simply disrespect me. You committed a federal crime." "Dad, no, wait, please." The panic in his voice had curdled into raw, undisguised terror. "It is not what you think. I was desperate. Natalie was threatening to walk away if we did not get that condo. I did not want to lose her. I was going to pay it back, I swear. I was going to liquidate some investments and cover the loan before you ever knew." "You do not have any investments, Ethan," I said, cutting cleanly through the fabrication. "Graham Hadley ran a full forensic audit of your finances yesterday. You are completely insolvent. You have maxed out 7 credit cards, and you hold not one tangible asset to your name. You were never going to pay it back. You were going to let your mother's legacy be consumed to prop up your hollow performance." "Hey, Dad, I'm sorry. I am so sorry." He was weeping now, loud, unguarded sobs breaking through the line. "Please don't do this. If charges are filed, I will go to prison. I will lose everything. You have to stop this. You have to call them off. I am the one who initiated the fraud investigation, Ethan," I said, delivering the words with the force of something final. "I filed the affidavit of forgery. I froze the accounts. You set this in motion, but I am the one controlling where it ends." His sobbing cut off abruptly, replaced by a strained, hyperventilating stillness. What do you want from me?" he breathed. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the gray-sealed sky. The trap had closed entirely. Now it was simply a matter of finishing it. "I want you at my corporate office tomorrow morning at 9 hours sharp," I said, my voice carrying no give whatsoever. "Bring Natalie with you. We are going to sit in the boardroom and we are going to settle everything. Do not be late." I ended the call before he could answer and set the phone on the table. The quiet that returned to the kitchen had a different quality to it. The storm had finally broken, and what remained in its wake was sharp, clean air ready for the last confrontation. I sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table on the 42nd floor of Pinnacle Tower. The room was built for intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto a sweeping view of the city, but the atmosphere inside was cold and exacting. Graham Hadley sat to my right, posture perfectly straight, a sleek leather briefcase resting on the table before him. To my left sat Detective Morrow from the Financial Crimes Division. He wore a plain gray suit and carried the kind of quiet absolute authority that needs no announcement. We sat without a word, listening for the elevator doors down the hall. The trap was fully set. I was about to bring the corporate guillotine down on the 2 people who believed they could dismantle my life and plunder my late wife's legacy. At precisely 9 heures, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Ethan walked in, first Natalie a half step behind him. They looked profoundly out of place against the clean, unforgiving lines of a corporate environment. Ethan had on a wrinkled suit that suggested he had not slept. Natalie wore oversized designer sunglasses shielding her bloodshot eyes. She kept her expensive handbag pulled tight against her chest. Despite how exhausted and rattled they appeared, a faint thread of arrogant hope still ran through them. They had walked in expecting a stern lecture, followed by a financial rescue. This was in their minds a family intervention, a moment where I would raise my voice before eventually writing the check that cleared their accounts. Ethan stopped midway into the room when he registered the other two men seated at the table. He looked at Graham, then at the detective. His stride broke. "Dad," he began, his voice thin and diminished inside the cavernous space. "Who are these people? I thought this was going to be settled between us." "We are settling it right now, Ethan," I replied, holding my voice perfectly level. "Sit down, both of you." Ethan pulled out a heavy leather chair and lowered himself into it slowly. Natalie sat beside him, sunglasses still fixed in place, arms crossed. She looked defensive and impatient. "Gerald, I hope this is not going to take long," she said, the old note of entitlement still present in her voice despite everything. "We have been under enormous stress this morning, and we need our bank accounts unfrozen immediately." I looked at the woman who had insisted I be seated in the back row of my own son's wedding. I felt nothing resembling pity. "Natalie," I said quietly, "the men sitting beside me are here to ensure that every dimension of your stress is thoroughly documented. On my right is my corporate counsel, Graham Hadley. On my left is Detective Morrow." Ethan swallowed. The sound carried in the stillness of the room. "Detective," he repeated the word sitting in his mouth like something bitter. "Dad, why is there a detective here? I thought you said you were going to fix the mortgage issue." "I said we were going to settle everything," I corrected him. "And in order to do that, we need to examine precisely what the two of you have been doing with my money." I reached across the mahogany surface and took hold of the first thick manila folder. I slid it the length of the table. It came to rest directly in front of Ethan. "Open it, Ethan," I said. "Take a look at the life you built." Ethan reached out with unsteady hands and opened the folder. Inside were high-resolution copies of the forged mortgage application. The fraudulent signature stared back at him from the page. The exact routing details of the $200,000 line of credit he had drawn against his late mother's estate were marked in yellow. Alongside those records sat the forensic financial audit page after page documenting his maxed-out credit cards and his total insolvency. Ethan stared at the papers. His breathing grew shallow and quick. "Dad, please," he whispered, a tear sliding down his pale cheek. "I can explain all of this. I just needed a little more time. I was going to make it right. What you are looking at is federal bank fraud. Ethan," I said, my tone carrying no softness whatsoever, "you committed identity theft against your own father to purchase a luxury condominium you had no means to afford. Detective Morrow has already reviewed these documents. He has the original bank statements. He has the security footage of you going through my filing cabinet. The bank has officially classified this transaction as a felony." Natalie leaned over and studied the contents of Ethan's folder. Behind her sunglasses, her eyes widened. In that moment, she fully grasped the scale of Ethan's ruin. He had nothing. The wealthy man she believed she had married was a complete fiction, a man on the verge of federal prison. "You idiot!" she hissed, recoiling from him, as though proximity itself was dangerous. "You lied to me? You told me you were liquidating your cryptocurrency portfolio. You stole from your own father to buy my house. You are pathetic." Ethan shrank under the assault. Before he could find any words, I picked up the second manila folder. It was noticeably thicker than the first. I set my hand flat on top of it. "Do not be so quick to condemn him, Natalie," I said, letting my voice fill the room completely. "My son is a desperate fool who committed forgery to impress a woman who holds him in contempt. But he is not the only person in this room who belongs behind bars." I pushed the second folder across the table. It stopped squarely in front of her. Natalie stared at it, her jaw tightening. "What is this?" she demanded, reaching for defiance, but the tremor in her voice gave her away. "Open it," I said. Natalie slowly lifted the cover. The top page was a printed spreadsheet with 5 specific wire transfers highlighted in sequence. The pages that followed contained offshore account registries and routing numbers. I watched her face travel from indignant anger to unmasked absolute terror. She tore off her sunglasses and stared at the financial records that proved her own undoing. "When Ethan came to me desperate for money to salvage his wedding, I gave him $80,000, I said, addressing the room. "I gave it to protect his pride. Ethan deposited those funds into a joint account and made the mistake of trusting you to pay the vendors, Natalie. But you did not pay the vendors, did you?" You systematically embezzled $25,000 of my money. You moved it through a shell company and deposited it into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands registered under your maiden name. Ethan snapped his head around to stare at his new wife. His mouth fell open. What? He breathed, his voice splintering. Natalie, what is he talking about? You stole the wedding money. You told me the caterer required enormous upfront deposits. She was skimming from the top. Ethan, I told him. She knew you were a fraud. She could see the money was running out, and she decided to build herself an exit using the funds I provided for your marriage. She robbed you before you even walked back up the aisle. Natalie slammed the folder shut. This is a violation of my privacy, she cried, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. You have no right to go into my personal accounts, Gerald. You cannot prove any of this. Graham Hadley leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table with calm precision. Actually, Mrs. Callahan, we have complete and irrefutable proof. Graham said, his voice smooth and quiet as a blade. We followed the digital footprint directly from the joint account to your offshore registry. The financial trail is beyond dispute. You committed wire fraud and grand theft embezzlement. The district attorney will have a very straightforward path to conviction. Ethan seized Natalie's arm, his face a mask of anguish and fury. You stole from me, he shouted. I destroyed my life for you. I forged my father's name to buy you a condominium, and you were stealing from me the entire time. Get your hands off me, you broke loser, Natalie shrieked, wrenching free of him. You lied to me from the start. You promised me a life of wealth and you have nothing. I am owed that money for enduring your pathetic lies. I settled back in my leather chair and watched the two of them come apart. The elaborate illusion they had constructed together was gone entirely. They were no longer a polished elite couple looking down on ordinary people. They were two common criminals turning on each other the instant the snare pulled tight. The corporate guillotine had fallen, and it cut through every lie they had ever told. They hurled accusations across the table, while their entire shared future collapsed into nothing. Detective Morrow rose from his chair. He reached behind his back and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic sound silenced the room in an instant. Ethan and Natalie went still, staring at the detective with wide, stricken eyes. The window for negotiations and hollow apologies had closed. The handcuffs lay on the polished mahogany surface. That single metallic sound had severed whatever remained between the bride and the groom. Natalie scrambled out of her leather chair and pressed herself against the floor-to-ceiling window, putting as much distance between herself and Ethan as the room allowed. Breathing hard, she leveled a manicured finger at the man she had vowed to love only days before. She turned to Detective Morrow and spoke rapidly, her voice saturated with desperation. "You cannot arrest me," she pleaded. "I had absolutely nothing to do with that forged mortgage. Ethan handles all the finances. He lied to me from the very beginning. He told me he was a millionaire and I believed him. I am a victim of his deception." Ethan stared at her, his face contorted into a mask of pure betrayal. "You are a victim," he yelled, taking a step toward her before Graham Hadley rose from his seat and blocked the path. "You drained my wedding fund. You stole $25,000 from the money my father entrusted to us. You were building yourself a golden parachute while pushing me to buy you a $200,000 luxury condominium. You demanded that specific unit, Natalie. You said you would cancel the wedding if we did not move into that exact building. I committed forgery to give you what you wanted." Natalie crossed her arms, her eyes blazing with contempt. "I demanded a lifestyle you swore you could provide." She fired back, her voice bouncing off the glass walls. "I did not tell you to commit a federal crime. I am not responsible for your pitiful inability to generate real wealth. You are a complete fraud, Ethan. You stole from your own father because you were too weak to build anything on your own." Ethan slammed his fist on the conference table. "And you are a common thief," he roared. "You embezzled from the man sitting directly across from you. You took money that was meant to pay the very caterers you humiliated at the reception. You think the police will let you walk away because you claim you were deceived. You routed stolen cash to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. That requires premeditation, Natalie. You are going to prison right alongside me." I settled back in my leather chair and watched them tear each other apart. It was a brutal, diminishing display of self-preservation. There was no loyalty between them. There was no love. The illusion of their polished elite partnership had evaporated entirely. They were like two cornered animals on a sinking vessel clawing at each other just to keep their heads above the water. For years, I had watched Ethan perform a version of himself. He was not adopting a sneering, superior manner to fit inside Natalie's shallow world. Now that fabricated world was caving in, and they were going for each other's throats to survive. Detective Morrow remained perfectly still, hands resting on his belt, letting them confess their crimes to one another in a room full of witnesses. Every accusation thrown across that boardroom was another piece of evidence for the prosecution. Graham Hadley recorded it all on a legal pad, capturing each admission of guilt with careful precision. Natalie began to cry, real tears of panic cutting through her expensive makeup. "Gerald, please," she said, swinging her attention back to me. "You have to understand my situation. I was terrified. I found out Ethan was buried in debt just weeks before the wedding. I moved that money because I needed something to fall back on. I was protecting my own future. I will give it back. I will wire the $25,000 directly into your account right now. Just please tell the detective to let me go." I looked at her tear-streaked face. The woman who had proudly removed me from my own son's wedding was now appealing to my mercy. "You cannot return money to buy your way out of a felony, Natalie." I said, my voice quiet and absolute. "The crime was committed the instant you initiated that fraudulent transfer. You stole from my holding company to enrich yourself." Ethan let out a short, harsh laugh. "Do not bother appealing to him, Natalie." He spat, his eyes burning. "He has been planning this since the night of the reception. He wants to see us destroyed. He is enjoying every second of it." "I am not enjoying this, Ethan," I corrected him, my voice settling into a heavier, more somber register. "It gives me no satisfaction to watch my son come apart. But I am not going to protect you from what your choices have earned. You chose to commit bank fraud. Natalie chose to commit embezzlement. You built a marriage on a foundation of mutual theft. There is one final matter to address before Detective Morrow takes over," I said, drawing a third and final document from my inner jacket pocket. I laid it flat on the mahogany table. Ethan and Natalie stopped arguing and fixed their eyes on the paper, utterly spent, every trace of their arrogant energy gone. "When you forged my signature to secure that mortgage, Ethan, you had the funds wired into an escrow account managed by a luxury title company," I explained. "You used those funds to finalize the purchase of your penthouse condominium in the downtown district. You moved your furniture and belongings into that unit 2 days before the wedding." Ethan gave a slow, heavy nod, his chest rising and falling. "Yes," he muttered. "That is my apartment." "It is not your apartment, Ethan," I said, my tone turning cold. "The title company you used is a subsidiary of my private holding corporation. When the bank froze the fraudulent escrow funds yesterday morning, the title company immediately voided your purchase agreement." Natalie drew a sharp breath and stepped forward. "What does that mean?" she demanded. "It means the deed to that luxury condominium reverted to the parent company," I told her, holding her panicked gaze. "It means my holding corporation owns the apartment you are currently living in. And because you hold no valid lease and no legal ownership, you are officially trespassing on my corporate property." I pushed the document across the table. It was a formal immediate eviction notice. "You have 0 days to vacate the premises," I said. "My security team is at the condominium right now, boxing up your personal belongings. The boxes will be left on the sidewalk. You have no access to the building. You have no home. You have no money. You have nothing." Natalie covered her face with both hands and let out a loud, agonizing wail. She folded into one of the leather chairs, completely broken. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the eviction notice as though the words were printed in a language he could not read. The reality of his total ruin finally crushed the last of whatever defiance remained in him. He had reached into my life to steal a legacy and build a counterfeit existence, and now he was left with nothing whatsoever. The heavy silence in the boardroom was broken only by the sound of Natalie weeping softly into her hands. Detective Morrow moved with practiced efficiency. He circled the far end of the mahogany table and approached Ethan. Ethan did not resist or attempt to argue. There was nowhere left to go and no lie left to construct. He simply stood up, shoulders caved inward, looking like a hollowed-out remnant of the arrogant man who had entered the building 30 minutes ago. Morrow took hold of Ethan's arm, turning him around with steady, unhurried firmness. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked sharply as they closed around my son's wrists. That metallic sound rang off the glass walls and marked the absolute end of his fraudulent life. Morrow spoke in a calm, measured voice, reciting the Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Ethan kept his head bowed. He did not look at me. He did not look at Natalie. His gaze stayed fixed on the carpet beneath his feet as the detective guided him toward the heavy glass doors. Just before they crossed the threshold, Ethan stopped. He turned his head slightly, one last hollow glance back over his shoulder. I gave him nothing in return, no anger, no pity. Only the steady, unflinching look of a man who had finally excised a long, festering wound. Morrow urged him forward, and they moved off down the corridor toward the service elevator that would carry my son down to a waiting police cruiser. I turned my attention to Natalie. She was still in the leather chair, dragging trembling fingers across her ruined makeup. She watched Ethan go, and for a brief moment, something that looked like relief crossed her face. She believed she had survived. In her mind, leaving without handcuffs meant she had somehow come out ahead. She picked up her designer handbag and got to her feet, attempting to gather whatever shred of composure she had left. I will be contacting my own attorneys, she said, her voice unsteady but reaching for defiance. You cannot simply throw my belongings into the street. I have rights. Graham Hadley closed his briefcase with a clean, decisive snap. You have the right to leave this building immediately. Mrs. Callahan, he said, his voice carrying no warmth at all. You are not being arrested today because the district attorney is still assembling the federal wire fraud charges against you. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. The indictment will be arriving in the mail very soon. And do not bother attempting to access that offshore account in the Cayman Islands. My forensic team handed those routing numbers directly to federal investigators. The account has been frozen and seized. You have absolutely no access to the money you stole. Natalie swallowed hard, her fingers closing around the strap of her bag until her knuckles went white. She turned toward the door, desperate to get out of that room. Before you leave, Natalie, I said, stopping her cold. There's one final piece of business to settle. She looked back at me, eyes still wide with residual fear. The $82,000 penalty for the ruined wedding reception hasn't gone anywhere, I told her. Since you and Ethan signed that venue contract together, the debt belongs equally to both of you. My collection agency will be going after your wages, your assets, and every account with your name on it. You came into my life demanding the finest of everything, and you're walking out with nothing but the clothes on your back and a crushing debt owed to the very people you treated with contempt. She parted her lips to protest, but the full weight of where she now stood strangled the words before they could surface. She had no husband to drain. She had no luxury condo waiting for her return. Her standing among her elite circle would be obliterated the moment the embezzlement and the eviction became public knowledge. She was stepping out onto cold city streets without a single dollar to her name, not even enough to hail a cab. She turned and practically sprinted out of the boardroom. The heavy glass doors swept shut behind her, sealing what she had made of herself. I stood in that quiet corporate suite alongside my lawyer, listening to the sound of her hurried footsteps dissolve into the distance. The corporate guillotine had come down clean, and the execution was an unqualified success. 6 months passed since those heavy glass doors had closed behind her. The turning of the seasons delivered a crisp autumn chill to the air. I sat on the wooden porch of my modest single-story home, both hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. The neighborhood lay quiet and still, exactly the way Eleanor and I had always cherished it. The dry leaves drifting from the old oak in the front yard made a sound like a soft whisper of approval. I drew a slow sip of the bitter coffee, letting its warmth spread across my chest. The ceaseless noise of arrogant demands and toxic entitlement had been entirely cleared from my life. It had been cut out like a surgeon removes something diseased, and the healing had been going remarkably well. The legal battles had concluded precisely as Graham Hadley had predicted. The fraudulent secondary mortgage was entirely expunged from the public records. Eleanor's sacred country estate was safe and whole, untouched by the greed that had tried so hard to swallow it. Ethan was currently serving a federal prison sentence for identity theft and bank fraud. He had appealed for leniency at sentencing, but the judge was unmoved by his tears. Natalie had accepted a plea deal to stay out of federal prison on the wire fraud charges. She kept herself out of a cell, but every stolen dollar was stripped away, and she was now working a minimum wage retail job in another city, grinding to pay back the $82,000 restitution she owed my holding company. They had wanted luxury without labor, and what they had earned themselves was absolute ruin. I felt no sorrow thinking about either of them now. There was no lingering anger, no residual resentment. I had grieved the loss of my son long ago. The moment I understood that the boy I had raised had been replaced by a stranger driven purely by greed, what remained now was a deep, unshakable stillness in my chest. I set my coffee mug down on the small wooden table beside my rocking chair. I reached over and unrolled a thick cylinder of heavy drafting paper, pressing the corners flat with two smooth stones. They were architectural blueprints. The detailed schematics showed a sweeping modern facility set among open green spaces and community gardens. The bold lettering across the title block read, "The Eleanor Callahan Community Center." I ran my fingers along the blue lines mapping out the interior. There was a large commercial kitchen, built to provide free culinary training for underprivileged young people looking for a foothold in a stable career. There was a sprawling workshop wing devoted to teaching hands-on trade skills, carpentry, plumbing, the kind of work that builds a life. It was a place designed to create real tangible futures for people willing to put in an honest day's effort, the precise opposite of the hollow, superficial country club world that Ethan and Natalie had worshipped. I had directed my corporate board to set aside a substantial grant to fund the full construction and operating endowment of the center. I was finally turning the resources of my holding company toward honoring the woman who had stood beside me when we built all of it from nothing. Eleanor never gave a thought to imported calla lilies or lavish tropical honeymoons. What she cared about was lifting people up and handing them the tools to stand on their own. When those doors opened, her true legacy would live on in every person who learned a trade and secured something better for their family. I rolled the blueprints back up and tucked them into their protective casing. I eased back into my wooden rocking chair, listening to it creak softly against the porch boards. I looked down at my worn chambray work shirt and my scuffed leather boots. I didn't need a tailored tuxedo to know I had made something of myself. I didn't need a luxury condominium to feel grounded. Real class isn't something you put on, and respect isn't something you can buy with a stolen credit card. I had come up through poverty. I had built a corporate empire. I had faced the deepest betrayal a man can know from his own blood, and I had walked straight through the fire without surrendering my integrity. I took one last sip of my coffee, watching the morning sun climb slowly as of the quiet rooftops of my working-class neighborhood. I was a man who needed absolutely nothing from anyone else. That is where Gerald's story rests now. Quiet mornings on a wooden porch, a warm mug of coffee, and blueprints for something that will outlast every act of greed that was ever aimed at him. This road cost him something that cannot be measured in dollars or court settlements. It cost him the version of his son he had always hoped was still in there somewhere. I believe God allows certain losses to clear the ground for something worthier to grow. What grew here was the Eleanor Callahan Community Center, a place built not from bitterness, but from a love that survived everything thrown against it. These are the kinds of father stories that don't make the headlines, but they are the ones that stay with you. If you take anything from Gerald's story, let it be this. Do not confuse silence for weakness. The quietest man in the room is sometimes the one who already holds every card. If someone uses your love as a tool against you, document everything and let the truth do the work that anger never could. Dad's revenge is not about cruelty. It is about refusing to let what you built be handed to people who never earned it. And when it is over, build something. Turn the pain into a foundation someone else can stand on. If this story stirred something in, you leave a comment below and tell me what part hit hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear that integrity still wins. And if you have not yet subscribed to his Hidden Revenge, there are more stories here that deserve to be told and heard. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourself.